Beneath the familiar narratives of kings and conquerors lies a haunting secret, the true story of Europe's dawn. Welcome to Words of Time. Join us as we journey into the murky depths of the Merovingian dynasty, a lost lineage whose untold influence casts a long shadow over the continent's earliest and darkest chapters. You won't believe what we uncover. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, it left behind not just a fallen capital or broken armies, but a world stripped of its organizing power. For centuries, Rome had been the center of law, administration, trade, and protection. Its disappearance in the 5th century did not simply remove a government, it erased a way of life. Across Western Europe, confusion filled the air. Cities that had once thrived with merchants, artisans, and officials now faced neglect and decline. Roads became unsafe, trade routes faltered, and the authority that had once come from imperial edicts vanished. The people who had lived under Roman order suddenly found themselves in a world without clear direction, uncertain who ruled, who protected them, or even what laws still stood. The end of Roman rule was not a single event, but a slow, uneven unraveling, and the vacuum it left drew in new forces ready to shape the next chapter of Europe's story. In the final decades of Roman control in the West, emperors were emperors mostly in name. The legions that once defended the empire's borders had thinned. Local commanders, tribal groups, and ambitious generals carved out small territories. The empire's economy, long dependent on trade and taxation, could no longer sustain itself. Rome's bureaucracy, admired for its precision and structure, became a shadow of what it had been. The collapse was both political and social. When the last emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in the late 5th century, few citizens could have grasped what the fall truly meant. To many, it was simply another change of rulers. Yet, within a generation, it was clear that the old world had ended. The fall of Rome created chaos not just in political terms, but in the minds of those who lived through it. The people of Gaul, Italy, Spain, and other former Roman provinces still thought of themselves as subjects of an empire that no longer existed. Latin remained the language of administration and religion, but the institutions that once upheld it crumbled. Landowners, bishops, and local warlords filled the gaps left by Roman governors. Soldiers who had once served imperial commands now pledged loyalty to whoever could feed and pay them. The collapse of centralized authority brought violence and uncertainty, yet it also opened the way for local leadership to develop. Out of this turmoil came groups that would later be seen as barbarian kingdoms. The term barbarian itself was a Roman label for anyone outside the empire's boundaries, but these people were not simply destroyers of civilization. Many had served in Roman armies, learned its language, and adopted its customs. They were part of the empire long before its official fall. Among them were the Franks, a loose confederation of tribes who lived near the Rhine. When Roman power weakened, the Franks began to expand their influence, not through aimless destruction, but through a gradual process of settlement, negotiation, and war. They were neither foreign conquerors nor loyal Roman subjects. They stood between two worlds, using both Roman traditions and their own tribal customs to build something new. The Franks' rise was closely tied to the Merovingian dynasty, a family that would shape early medieval Europe for nearly 3 centuries. The Merovingians are often portrayed as rough and warlike, but they were far more complex. They did not simply sweep across Gaul as invaders. They emerged from within the crumbling Roman order, adapting what remained of it for their own purposes. Their leaders were not ignorant of Roman ways. They used Roman titles, kept Latin scribes, and respected the Church, which had become one of the few surviving sources of order. They were, in a sense, both heirs to and rebels against the Roman world. The founder most often credited with establishing Merovingian power was Clovis, a man whose rule marked a turning point in European history. He inherited a small realm among the Salian Franks, but expanded it through a combination of warfare, diplomacy, and strategic alliances. Clovis's decision to convert to Christianity was not only a personal act of faith, but a masterstroke of politics. By embracing the religion of the Roman population and aligning with the Catholic Church rather than the Arian Christianity followed by many other Germanic rulers, he gained legitimacy and support from the Roman clergy and people. His conversion helped bridge the divide between conquerors and the conquered, uniting them under a shared belief. Clovis and his successors built a realm that looked both backward and forward. They kept Roman laws where useful, but they also wrote down their own, such as the Salic law, which blended Roman legal ideas with Frankish customs. They used Roman cities as administrative centers, but relied on kinship and personal loyalty more than on bureaucratic systems. Power under the Merovingians was personal, not institutional. Kings ruled by charisma, military strength, and alliances, not by the authority of an office. This made their rule fragile but flexible. In a world where central control was nearly impossible, personal bonds often worked better than formal hierarchies. The decline of Rome left a fragmented Europe, but fragmentation did not mean stagnation. Instead, it created a fertile ground for new forms of power and organization. The Merovingians were not alone in this. Across the former empire, similar experiments took shape. In Italy, the Ostrogoths under Theodoric sought to preserve Roman administration while ruling as outsiders. In Spain, the Visigoths built a kingdom that combined Roman law with Gothic traditions. Yet it was in the Frankish lands that a lasting foundation for medieval Europe began to form. The world the Merovingians inherited was harsh. Roads were in disrepair, trade networks had broken down, and literacy had declined outside the church. Yet, within this rough environment, new relationships formed between rulers, the church, and the people. The church became the main institution that connected the new kingdoms to the memory of Rome. Bishops acted as administrators, judges, and advisors. Monasteries became centers of learning and stability. The Merovingian kings recognized the church's importance and often relied on it to legitimize their rule. They granted land and privileges to religious institutions, which in return supported royal authority. This cooperation between church and king became a defining feature of medieval Europe. It helped transform raw military power into something resembling governance. The church offered moral authority and continuity, while the kings provided protection and political leadership. The balance was not always easy. Merovingian kings were often violent, and their courts were known for intrigue and assassination. Yet even in their brutality, there was an emerging sense of order, a recognition that power needed to be justified by something more than force. As the Merovingian realm grew, so did its complexity. Clovis's descendants divided the kingdom among their sons, following the custom of partible inheritance. This practice kept power within the family, but often led to rivalry and civil war. Still, even through the constant conflicts, the idea of a Frankish kingdom survived. The divisions did not erase the shared identity that had begun to form. Latin remained the language of the church and administration, while local dialects evolved slowly toward what would later become French and German. The mix of Roman and Frankish cultures produced something entirely new. In the countryside, life continued much as it had under Rome, though on a smaller scale. Peasants worked the land, bound by obligation to local lords who offered protection in return. Towns shrank but did not vanish. Some, like Paris, eventually became centers of royal authority. The Merovingians used these towns as seats of power, though their rule was often itinerant, moving with the king's court from one stronghold to another. The system was fluid, based on relationships rather than fixed institutions. Yet it worked well enough to hold a vast territory together for generations. The fall of Rome had stripped away the illusion of permanence. Under the Merovingians, Europe learned to live with change. Instead of one vast empire ruled from a single center, power now rested in many hands. Authority became local and loyalty personal. This decentralization, though chaotic, allowed societies to adapt to different conditions. It also encouraged the growth of regional identities. The Franks in the north, the Burgundians in the east, and the Aquitanians in the south all developed distinct cultures under the loose framework of Frankish rule. The Merovingian world was not peaceful, but it was creative. It produced the beginnings of what would later be called feudalism, a system built on mutual obligations between lord and vassal. It also laid the groundwork for the rise of the Carolingians, who would later transform the Frankish kingdom into an empire under Charlemagne. Yet none of that would have been possible without the Merovingian ability to bridge the gap between the Roman and post-Roman worlds. They did not seek to restore the empire as it had been, but to build something that fit their reality. The idea of a dark age following Rome's fall is misleading. Darkness suggests absence, but what truly followed was transformation. The light that Rome had once provided was replaced by many smaller lights, local leaders, bishops, kings, and communities finding their own way. The Merovingians were part of this process. They were not the heirs of a single tradition, but the creators of a new one. Their rule was marked by contradictions. Christian yet violent, Romanized yet tribal, chaotic yet enduring. Through these contradictions, Europe began to take on a form that would last for centuries. The Church's growing influence during this period cannot be overstated. It preserved literacy, maintained legal records, and offered a sense of continuity. The Merovingians, though often ruthless, understood its value. They founded monasteries, endowed churches, and sought the blessing of bishops. In doing so, they tied their authority to something greater than their own might. The Church, in turn, gained protection and resources, allowing it to spread more deeply into rural areas. This partnership laid the foundation for the medieval synthesis of faith and power. Despite their achievements, the Merovingians eventually faced decline. By the 7th and 8th centuries, their kings had become figureheads, overshadowed by their own officials known as mayors of the palace. These administrators managed the royal estates and armies, slowly accumulating power until they effectively ruled in the king's names. The most famous of these was Charles Martel, who defended Frankish lands against external threats and strengthened the foundations for the Carolingian dynasty. Yet even in their decline, the Merovingians had left a permanent mark. They had shown that political authority could survive without the framework of the Roman Empire. The transformation that began after Rome's fall was not a return to barbarism, but a reimagining of order. Where the empire had relied on written laws and distant administration, the new kingdoms relied on kinship, oaths, and faith. It was a different kind of civilization, less centralized, more personal, but deeply rooted in human relationships. The Merovingians, for all their flaws, embodied this shift. They ruled in a world still haunted by the memory of Rome, yet they did not live in its shadow. They built on its ruins, and in doing so, created the first outlines of medieval Europe. In many ways, the world that emerged after the fall of Rome was more flexible and resilient than the empire had been in its final days. Rome's grandeur had depended on vast resources and strict hierarchies. When those broke down, the system collapsed. The Merovingians' world, by contrast, could endure hardship because it was smaller and more adaptable. Local rulers could respond quickly to local needs. Communities relied on personal ties rather than distant authority. This made the new order less impressive, but more sustainable. The power vacuum left by Rome's fall was frightening, but it also offered opportunity. It allowed for experimentation in governance and social organization. The Merovingians filled that vacuum not by imitating Rome, but by creating something suited to their time. They drew from Roman administration, Christian faith, and Germanic custom, blending them into a new synthesis. The result was messy and violent, but it worked. From this foundation, later dynasties would build the structures that defined Europe for the next 1,000 years. The story of the Merovingians is often overshadowed by that of the Carolingians, but it deserves recognition as the true beginning of post-Roman Europe. Their world was not the end of civilization, but its rebirth in a different form. The chaos that followed Rome's collapse did not erase the past, it transformed it. Roman roads, laws, and language survived in fragments, carried forward by the Church and adapted by new rulers. The Merovingians stood at the center of this transformation, bridging the ancient and the medieval worlds. As the centuries passed, the memory of Rome faded, replaced by new symbols of authority. Kings were no longer emperors, they were lords among other lords, bound by oaths and faith. The Church became the keeper of moral and intellectual life, while warriors and landowners managed the practical realities of rule. This balance of spiritual and temporal power, first shaped in the Merovingian age, became the defining feature of Europe's medieval order. Looking back, the fall of Rome appears less as a collapse than as a transition. The immediate chaos was real. Cities fell silent, armies disbanded, and the economy withered. But from that destruction came renewal. The Merovingians, born from the wreckage, showed that order could arise again in new forms. Their world was smaller, rougher, and more personal, but it was also more deeply rooted in the realities of human life. They proved that civilization did not depend on marble buildings or imperial decrees, but on the will to govern, to believe, and to endure. By the time the Merovingian line gave way to the Carolingians, Europe had changed beyond recognition. What had begun as a collection of post-Roman territories had become a network of kingdoms bound by faith and custom. The roads were rougher, the palaces humbler, but the sense of purpose stronger. A new dawn had risen, not one that restored Rome, but one that carried its spirit forward in a different guise. The Western world had moved beyond the empire, yet it remained shaped by its memory. In that sense, the fall of Rome was not an end, but a beginning. The chaos it unleashed forced people to rebuild from the ground up, creating institutions that could survive without imperial command. The Merovingians, stepping into the void, became the architects of that survival. They may not have known it, but in their hands lay the foundations of medieval Europe, the first stones of a new civilization rising from the ruins of the old. When Clovis came to power among the Salian Franks, he was far from the image of a mighty king who could unify an entire region. He began as one of many minor warlords scattered across the remnants of what had once been Roman Gaul. The land was a patchwork of competing powers. Small kingdoms led by Germanic chieftains, Roman landowners struggling to keep control of their estates, and bishops trying to maintain some semblance of order through the church. Clovis inherited little more than a modest territory and a group of loyal warriors. Yet within a generation, he would forge a kingdom that laid the foundation for both France and Germany. His story is one of ambition, cunning, and a deep understanding of how to turn faith into power. The Western Roman Empire had fallen, leaving behind a vacuum that no one seemed able to fill. The Visigoths dominated the south, the Burgundians ruled in the east, and scattered Roman enclaves tried to hold on to their traditions. Among this confusion, Clovis saw opportunity. He was not the first to try to seize it, but he was the one who understood that brute force alone would not be enough. To rise above other Frankish chieftains, he needed more than warriors and victories. He needed legitimacy. That legitimacy would not come from birthright, for among the Franks, leadership was based on strength and success in battle, not on noble descent. Instead, he would earn his authority through conquest and faith. Clovis was ruthless, even by the standards of his age. He relied on surprise, deception, and swift violence to destroy rivals before they could unite against him. One of his early victories came against Syagrius, the Roman ruler of the domain of Soissons, who still clung to the idea of Roman order in northern Gaul. By defeating Syagrius, Clovis did more than gain territory. He symbolically ended the last vestige of Roman authority in the region. The fall of Soissons opened the way for Frankish dominance and announced the arrival of a new power. Clovis's methods were often brutal but calculated. He knew that to hold his growing realm, he needed loyalty. Among his warriors, loyalty came through rewards and reputation. He shared the spoils of war generously, ensuring that his men fought not only out of duty, but out of desire for gain. Yet he also understood how to balance generosity with fear. Those who betrayed him or questioned his authority were swiftly eliminated. This combination of reward and terror became the cornerstone of his rule. He built his power not on laws or institutions, but on personal bonds and the unshakable belief that he was the strongest of all. Even as Clovis expanded his power through warfare, he faced the challenge of ruling a diverse population. His lands included Franks, Gallo-Romans, and other tribes, each with their own customs and beliefs. The old Roman population still looked to the Catholic Church for guidance, while many of the Germanic peoples, including the Visigoths and Burgundians, followed Arian Christianity, a form of the faith that rejected the full divinity of Christ. The Franks, for their part, still held to pagan traditions, honoring their old gods and ancestral spirits. Clovis realized that unity would require more than military victory. It would require a shared belief that could bridge these divides. His conversion to Nicene Christianity, often seen as the defining moment of his reign, was both a spiritual and political turning point. According to tradition, his wife Clotilde, a Burgundian princess and devout Catholic, had long urged him to abandon paganism. Clovis resisted until a critical moment during battle, when he faced possible defeat. In desperation, he called upon the Christian God, promising that if victory came, he would convert. When his army triumphed, Clovis kept his word. His baptism, performed by Bishop Remigius of Reims, was more than a personal act of faith. It was a declaration that the Franks would stand with the Roman Church and against the Arian kingdoms surrounding them. This conversion changed everything. It gave Clovis a powerful ally in the Catholic Church, which saw in him a champion who could restore Christian order in the lands once ruled by Rome. It also gave his rule a sense of divine legitimacy that no other Germanic king possessed. The bishops of Gaul, who had been wary of barbarian rulers, now saw Clovis as a protector of the faith. They offered him their support, their administrative skills, and perhaps most importantly, their influence over the Roman population. Through this alliance, Clovis gained access to a network of educated clerics who could help him govern and legitimize his authority in writing, ceremony, and law. The symbolism of Clovis's baptism cannot be overstated. He entered the cathedral not merely as a warrior, but as a ruler anointed by God. The ritual echoed the imperial ceremonies of Rome, blending Christian sanctity with royal power. In a time when kingship was still largely defined by the sword, Clovis introduced the idea that divine favor could sanctify rule. His people, who followed their leader's faith, gradually converted as well, transforming the Franks into the first Catholic Germanic nation. This gave Clovis a unifying ideology that transcended tribal loyalties. Where once his warriors fought for him as a warlord, now they saw him as a king chosen by God. Religion became a tool of statecraft. Clovis used the church not only to strengthen his legitimacy, but also to consolidate his rule over conquered peoples. He supported the building of churches and the appointment of loyal bishops, blending faith with governance. The church, in turn, praised him as a new Constantine, a comparison that linked him to the first Christian emperor of Rome. In this way, Clovis positioned himself as both the successor to Roman tradition and the founder of a new Christian kingdom. With the church behind him, Clovis turned again to war. He expanded his realm through a series of campaigns that pushed the Frankish frontier across much of Gaul. His victories over rival Frankish kings were especially significant. In a world where power was constantly divided among competing warlords, Clovis achieved what few had done before him. He united the Franks under a single crown. The process was neither peaceful nor merciful. Rivals who refused to submit were killed, often through betrayal or execution after false promises of peace. Clovis was patient when needed and cruel when necessary. He did not hesitate to eliminate even his own kin if he suspected disloyalty. In doing so, he ensured that the Merovingian line would rule without internal division, at least for a time. Clovis's wars against external enemies further expanded his power. His most important campaign was against the Visigoths in southern Gaul. The Visigothic king Alaric was a strong ruler, and his kingdom extended across much of modern Spain and southern France. Yet the Visigoths followed Arian Christianity, which set them apart from the Catholic Church and the now Catholic Franks. Clovis used this religious difference as both pretext and rallying cry. His war was not only for land, but for faith. When his forces defeated Alaric near the city of Vuille, the victory marked a turning point in European history. It brought most of southern Gaul under Frankish control and made Clovis the dominant power in the region. This triumph gave Clovis a reputation far beyond his own borders. The Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople, recognizing his influence, granted him honorary titles and welcomed him as a partner in maintaining order in the West. Though the gesture was symbolic, it linked Clovis to the memory of the empire that had once ruled the world. To his subjects and allies, he now appeared not as a barbarian conqueror, but as a legitimate heir to Roman authority. As his kingdom grew, Clovis began to organize his territories more systematically. He kept elements of Roman administration where possible, relying on Gallo-Roman nobles to manage local affairs under his supervision. He respected Roman law for his Roman subjects, while allowing the Franks to follow their own customs. This dual system reflected the diversity of his realm and showed a level of political pragmatism rare for his time. The writing of the Salic Law during his reign further demonstrated his desire to blend tradition with order. It was not a codified law in the Roman sense, but a record of Frankish customs, written down to ensure consistency. In preserving his people's customs while adopting the legal practices of Rome, Clovis created a model for governance that would endure throughout the Merovingian period. Despite these achievements, his rule remained deeply personal. The loyalty of his followers depended on his ability to lead in battle and distribute rewards. The state was not an abstract institution, but an extension of the king himself. This made succession dangerous. Clovis's death brought the familiar pattern of division, as his sons split the kingdom among themselves. Yet even divided, the realm he had built survived, a testament to his success in creating something larger than himself. Clovis's leadership was defined by his ability to use every advantage, military, political, and spiritual, to strengthen his position. He was a warrior in the old sense, but also a ruler who grasped the importance of image and ideology. His conversion to Christianity was not a moment of weakness, but a calculated act of statecraft that reshaped the identity of his people. By aligning himself with the Church, he gained both divine authority and practical support. By defeating his rivals, he created unity where none had existed. And by claiming the legacy of Rome, he gave his kingdom a sense of continuity with the past. Under his rule, the Merovingian realm took shape as more than a collection of tribes. It became a political entity with a shared faith, common law, and a growing sense of identity. The lands he conquered would form the core of what later generations would call France and Germany. His victories linked the northern and southern parts of Gaul, uniting them under one power for the first time since the days of Rome. His legacy was not only territorial but cultural. He transformed the Franks from a pagan tribe into the dominant Christian power of Western Europe. Clovis's character combined vision and violence. He was not a philosopher king, but a man shaped by war. Yet he understood, more than most of his contemporaries, that raw force could not hold a kingdom together. He used faith as a means of unity and law as a means of control. His story reveals how new forms of authority emerged from the ruins of the old empire. Where Rome had ruled through bureaucracy and empire, Clovis ruled through personality and faith. The difference was profound, and it marked the beginning of a new political order that would define Europe for centuries. The transformation of the Franks under Clovis's leadership also reshaped the balance of power across the continent. His alliance with the Catholic Church set a pattern that other rulers would follow, linking religious and political authority in ways that would become central to medieval kingship. His victories demonstrated that legitimacy could be built not only through ancestry or inheritance, but through the support of divine sanction and practical strength. In this, Clovis laid the foundation for a tradition in which the sword and the cross would be inseparable symbols of power. The unity he achieved was fragile but enduring enough to outlast his lifetime. His successors would fight and divide the kingdom, but the idea of a united Frankish realm persisted. The name Francia began to appear in writings of the time, signaling that what Clovis had created was more than a tribe's dominion. It was a kingdom with a shared faith, culture, and destiny. The line of Merovingian kings that followed him would eventually weaken, but their rule would continue to shape Europe's political landscape. Clovis's ruthless rise from a minor chieftain to a king who commanded most of Gaul stands as one of the most significant transformations in European history. His ambition was matched by his understanding of power's many forms. He conquered not only with the sword but with the mind, recognizing that unity required belief as much as fear. The kingdom he left behind was not stable in the modern sense, but it was alive, dynamic, and capable of growth. It contained within it the seeds of future empires and the outlines of nations yet to come. The story of Clovis is a reminder that from chaos can come creation. In a world shattered by the fall of Rome, he built a new order, guided by faith and sustained by strength. His reign marked the moment when the old world of emperors gave way to the new world of kings. The Merovingian kingdom he founded was the bridge between ancient Rome and medieval Christendom, a structure rising from the ruins, lit by the vision of a man who saw beyond his time. Clovis's life was short, but his legacy immense. His conquests, his conversion, and his consolidation of power turned the Franks into the central force of Western Europe. In the centuries that followed, his name would be remembered not only as a warrior's, but as the founder of a kingdom that endured, evolved, and became the heart of Europe's future. He was in every sense the architect of a new dawn born from the ashes of the old world. After the death of Clovis, the kingdom he had forged remained vast and powerful, but it was built on fragile foundations. His rule had depended on his personal strength and the loyalty he inspired among warriors and nobles. Once he was gone, that unity began to fray. His sons divided the realm among themselves, each taking a portion to rule. This practice, rooted in Frankish custom, was meant to preserve fairness within the royal family, but it came at a cost. The divisions led to rivalry, mistrust, and a cycle of internal conflict that weakened the very structure their father had created. Over time, these repeated partitions and wars eroded the strength of the Merovingian dynasty, setting the stage for the gradual rise of others who would hold true power in their place. In the early years after Clovis, his descendants still carried the prestige of his name. The memory of his victories and the unity he had achieved gave legitimacy to his heirs. Yet none possessed his commanding presence or political skill. The Merovingian kings that followed often found themselves entangled in endless feuds, not only with neighboring realms, but within their own families. Brothers fought brothers, sons conspired against fathers, and queens plotted to secure their own children's inheritance. This pattern of division created an atmosphere of constant tension at court and among the nobility. As these internal struggles grew more frequent, royal authority became diluted. Each new division of the realm created more kings and smaller kingdoms, each competing for influence. The Franks remained one people, bound by language and faith, but their political unity was repeatedly broken. At the same time, the demands of governing a large and diverse territory required administrators who could manage local affairs effectively. Because the kings often spent their time fighting one another, real power gradually shifted into the hands of royal officials who could maintain order in their absence. Chief among these officials were the mayors of the palace, who began as household managers but eventually became the true rulers behind the throne. The position of mayor of the palace was originally practical, not political. The Merovingian kings, like their father Clovis, maintained itinerant courts that moved from one royal estate to another. The king's household was both his administration and his army, and managing it required skill and authority. The mayor oversaw finances, land, and the distribution of rewards. Over time, as kings became more dependent on their advisors, mayors began to exercise greater influence. They managed correspondence, oversaw judicial matters, and commanded troops in the king's name. What began as a servant's role evolved into one of immense power. By the 7th century, the mayors of the palace had become indispensable. They maintained the loyalty of the nobility and ensured that the kingdom continued to function despite the weakness of its kings. Many of the Merovingian rulers of this period were young, inexperienced, or disinterested in government. Some preferred the pleasures of the court to the burdens of rule, leaving daily affairs to their advisors. This period gave rise to the nickname Rois Faineants, meaning do-nothing kings. The phrase was coined later by chroniclers who looked back on this era with disdain, but it captured the reality that royal power had become more symbolic than real. These so-called shadow kings retained the outward trappings of authority. They wore the long hair that symbolized their sacred royal status, presided over ceremonies, and issued decrees in their name. But behind the scenes, it was the mayors who decided policy, commanded armies, and made alliances. The court became a stage on which the king appeared, while others directed the performance. To the common people, the difference might not have been immediately visible. Taxes were still collected, disputes settled, and armies raised. Yet those who understood the workings of power knew that the Merovingian throne was losing its meaning. The rise of the mayors of the palace did not happen without struggle. Ambitious nobles and royal relatives resented their growing authority, leading to intrigue and assassination. The court became a dangerous place where loyalty was rare and survival often depended on cunning. Marriages were arranged and broken for political advantage. Alliances shifted with every succession. In this climate, trust became a luxury few could afford. Those who held power knew that it might vanish overnight through betrayal or murder. One of the most powerful mayors of the palace emerged in the Kingdom of Austrasia, the eastern portion of the Frankish realm. His name was Pepin of Herstal, and he belonged to a family that would eventually replace the Merovingians altogether. Pepin was not a king, but he ruled like one. He managed the kingdom's affairs with a firm hand, commanding the loyalty of the nobility and ensuring peace among rival factions. Through skill, persistence, and shrewd alliances, he established the Carolingian family as the dominant force in the Frankish world. His leadership revealed how far royal authority had declined and how much power could be exercised without a crown. Pepin's rise did not mark an immediate end to the Merovingians. The dynasty continued, but its kings were increasingly little more than figureheads. The mayors of the palace used them as instruments to legitimize their own rule. Royal charters and proclamations were still issued in the king's name, but they were written by the mayor's scribes. The king's seal, once a symbol of power, became a formality. The real decisions were made elsewhere. The weakness of the later Merovingians was not solely a matter of personality. It was also structural. The very customs that had once allowed Clovis to build his kingdom now worked against his descendants. The division of inheritance among sons ensured constant fragmentation. Each branch of the family sought to expand its territory at the expense of the others. The constant reshuffling of borders created confusion and instability. Nobles exploited this disorder to assert greater independence, building their own local power bases that rivaled royal authority. The church, though often supportive of the monarchy, also grew stronger, acquiring land and influence that sometimes placed it beyond the reach of the crown. The image of the do-nothing kings has sometimes been exaggerated, but it reflects a real loss of control. These kings were not lazy by nature, but they were trapped within a system that had outgrown them. They inherited a world where power was shifting toward regional magnates and administrators. Their position as sacred kings, once enough to command respect, no longer guaranteed obedience. The charisma that had once surrounded the Merovingian name had faded. What remained was ritual without substance, authority without command. As the power of the kings waned, violence became a common means of settling disputes. Assassinations were frequent, and poisoning was a favored method of removing rivals. Family loyalty counted for little when the prize was control of a kingdom. Royal courts became arenas of intrigue, where whispered conspiracies could change the fate of entire realms. The line between friend and enemy blurred, and few rulers died peacefully in their beds. The chroniclers of the time, often monks, wrote with horror of the bloodshed and betrayal that stained the royal family. They saw in these events a sign of moral decay, a punishment for the sins of pride and greed. Despite the corruption and chaos, the Merovingian world was not entirely in decline. It was changing. The shift of power from kings to mayors was part of a broader transformation in how authority was exercised. Governance was becoming more localized and practical. The mayors of the palace, often drawn from the nobility, understood the needs of their regions better than distant kings could. They were closer to the people and more attuned to the realities of administration and defense. In many ways, they were the natural successors to the old Roman provincial governors. Among the families that benefited from this transformation, none were more successful than the Carolingians, descendants of Pepin of Herstal. They understood that legitimacy required more than force. It required continuity with the past. While they ruled through the Merovingian kings, they cultivated an image of faithful service to the dynasty. They presented themselves as protectors of the realm and defenders of the church. Over time, their authority came to seem not a usurpation but a fulfillment of the king's duties. When the moment finally came for them to take the throne, it would appear less as a revolution and more as a natural evolution. The decline of the Merovingians was a slow process, not a sudden collapse. It unfolded over generations, marked by periods of brief resurgence followed by renewed weakness. Some later kings tried to reassert control, but the machinery of power had already shifted beyond their reach. The mayors commanded the armies, controlled the finances, and managed the alliances that kept the kingdom intact. Without their cooperation, the kings could do nothing. In effect, the monarchy became ceremonial, while the real governance of the realm rested with others. This transformation was visible even in the language of the time. Charters began to describe the mayors as princes or leaders of the Franks, titles once reserved for kings. The church, which had long supported the monarchy, now looked to the mayors for protection and patronage. Bishops sought their favor, and monasteries received their gifts. The spiritual legitimacy that had once belonged exclusively to the crown began to spread to those who actually governed. Yet the shadow of the Merovingian past still lingered. The long-haired kings remained a potent symbol of continuity. To depose them outright would have been seen as sacrilege, for their blood was believed to carry divine blessing. The Carolingians understood this and acted carefully. They ruled behind the scenes, maintaining the appearance of loyalty until their power was unassailable. The last Merovingian kings, reduced to little more than spectators, watched as their mayors shaped the destiny of the realm they were supposed to rule. Within the royal courts, intrigue continued to swirl. Assassinations, betrayals, and secret pacts remained common. The court of Neustria, one of the main divisions of the kingdom, became infamous for its conspiracies. Noble families competed for influence, often turning to the mayors for support or protection. Each alliance carried hidden dangers, as loyalties could shift overnight. Women of the royal family played significant roles in these struggles, acting as mediators, manipulators, and sometimes avengers. Their influence, though often unrecorded in official histories, was felt in the decisions that shaped the fate of the dynasty. By the time Pepin of Herstal's grandson, Charles Martel, rose to power, the decline of the Merovingian line was irreversible. Charles, like his grandfather, ruled as mayor of the palace, but his authority was absolute. He defended the kingdom against external threats, including the famous victory that checked Muslim expansion into Western Europe. His successes in battle and his skill in governance made him the de facto ruler of the Franks, while the reigning Merovingian king remained a silent figurehead. Charles did not claim the title of king, but everyone knew who truly ruled. The term Shadow Kings became a fitting description of the last Merovingians. They sat on thrones, but cast no light of their own. They were kept for appearances, their presence necessary only to maintain the illusion of continuity. Their power was ceremonial, their authority confined to rituals and signatures. They traveled in royal processions and presided over religious ceremonies, but they had no command over policy or war. The real monarchs were those who stood behind them, the mayors of the palace, the generals, and the bishops who shaped the destiny of the realm. As the 8th century progressed, the tension between appearance and reality could no longer be sustained. The Carolingian family, whose members had long controlled the machinery of power, began to see the Merovingian crown as a formality that no longer served a purpose. Pepin the Short, son of Charles Martel, took the decisive step. He sought and received the blessing of the Pope to depose the last Merovingian king and assume the throne himself. This moment marked the true end of the Merovingian age and the beginning of a new era in European history. Looking back, the decline of the Merovingians was not simply a story of decay. It was the story of transformation, of how power moved from a sacred kingship to a more practical, military, and administrative form of rule. The do-nothing kings were not entirely without purpose. They served as a bridge between the old idea of divine kingship and the new model of leadership that would dominate the Middle Ages. Their weakness allowed others to step forward and redefine what it meant to rule. The shadow that fell over the Merovingian dynasty was long, but it was not empty. From its depths emerged a new vision of authority that would shape the future. The mayors of the palace, once servants, had become masters. The church, once dependent on royal favor, had become a power in its own right. The nobility, once bound by kinship, had learned to act through alliance and calculation. Out of intrigue, betrayal, and gradual change, a new order arose, one that would soon find its embodiment in the Carolingian Empire and in the figure of Charlemagne. The age of the Shadow Kings was the twilight of one world and the dawn of another. Though the Merovingian dynasty faded, it left behind the framework upon which medieval Europe would stand. Its decline was not simply an end but a transformation, the passing of power from the hands of kings who had forgotten how to rule to those who would learn to build empires. The story of the Merovingians does not end with the fall of their political power. Even as their dynasty slipped into obscurity under the shadow of the Carolingians, the memory of their rule lived on in myth, legend, and quiet influence. The Merovingians, whose long-haired kings had once ruled vast lands, became figures of fascination for centuries after their disappearance from history. Their world had been one of shifting loyalties, faith, and power, but it was also a world that produced a deep sense of mystery. Over time, fact and imagination blended, creating a legacy that stretched far beyond the realities of their rule. The myths surrounding the Merovingians began even before their decline. The most famous of these was the belief in their semi-divine origins. According to legend, the first Merovingian, a man named Merovec, was born from the union of his mother and a sea creature or water spirit. This myth suggested that the royal bloodline was touched by something beyond the human realm, a common theme in early medieval thought where divine or supernatural ancestry was seen as a mark of legitimacy. It set the Merovingians apart, giving their kingship a sacred character that made their rule seem destined rather than achieved. This story, though strange to modern ears, reflected how people of the time understood authority. To rule was not merely a matter of inheritance or strength. It was to embody a power that came from the divine order of the world. The long hair of the Merovingian kings became another central part of their legend. In an age when symbols mattered as much as deeds, the hair of a Merovingian king was no ordinary feature. It was seen as the physical sign of royal power. To cut a king's hair was to strip him of his authority, a ritual humiliation that often marked deposition. Chroniclers described kings being shorn before being sent to monasteries. Their power ended with the loss of their hair. This belief gave the Merovingians an aura of sanctity and mystery. Their long hair was not vanity, but a sacred emblem, connecting them to their ancestors and to the divine. In later centuries, artists and writers would use this image to evoke the ancient majesty of a forgotten age, when kings were both rulers and symbols of a deeper, mystical order. The mixture of myth and history that surrounded the Merovingians was partly a reflection of the world they had ruled. Their era stood between the clarity of Roman civilization and the emerging structure of medieval Europe. In that in-between space, legend flourished. The Church, which recorded much of what was known about them, often shaped their image according to moral and religious lessons. Chroniclers like Gregory of Tours portrayed them as both chosen and cursed, rulers who embodied divine favor but also suffered for their sins. Their stories were filled with miracles, prophecies, and acts of divine judgment. The boundaries between history and moral tale were blurred, leaving future generations with an image of the Merovingians as both real kings and mythic figures. As the Carolingians rose to power, they had little reason to preserve the memory of their predecessors. To justify their own rule, they portrayed the Merovingians as weak and decadent, rulers who had lost their right to the throne. The do-nothing kings label, which emerged later, served this purpose well. It allowed the Carolingians to present themselves as saviors who had restored order after a period of decline. This narrative was powerful, but it was also selective. It ignored the fact that the Merovingians had laid the groundwork for the very structures that the Carolingians inherited. Their laws, administrative practices, and alliances with the church provided the foundation upon which later rulers built. Yet in the political imagination of Europe, the Merovingians became the lost dynasty, a family whose power had faded into legend while their successors claimed the glory. The idea of the lost dynasty gave the Merovingians a strange kind of immortality. They became a blank canvas for later storytellers, historians, and even mystics. In medieval chronicles, they were remembered as kings of a more ancient and mysterious world, closer to the age of saints and miracles. In modern times, they would reappear in speculative histories and esoteric writings, often linked to secret bloodlines and hidden knowledge. What had begun as royal propaganda transformed into myth, a reminder of how history can become legend when memory fades but fascination remains. Beyond their myths, the Merovingians left a real and lasting legacy on the shape of European society. One of their most enduring contributions was in law. The Salic law, which took form during the reign of Clovis, remained influential for centuries. Though it began as a record of tribal customs, it grew into a cornerstone of medieval legal thought. It established principles that would define property rights, inheritance, and social order. The law reflected the world of its makers, practical, personal, and deeply rooted in community life. It did not aim for the universal rationality of Roman law, but for the preservation of harmony among families and tribes. Yet its emphasis on written codes helped preserve order in a time when memory and custom often replaced official record. One of the most significant features of the Salic law was its treatment of inheritance, especially concerning land. It laid out clear rules about how property was to be divided among male heirs, ensuring that land remained within the family. This principle would shape the future of European landholding. By linking land and lineage, the Merovingians helped create the social fabric that would later evolve into feudalism. Under feudalism, land was not simply property. It was the basis of loyalty, service, and power. The seeds of that system were sown in Merovingian times, when land became the currency of politics and the foundation of local authority. The Merovingians also influenced the relationship between kings and the nobility. Their reign saw the emergence of a class of landowners whose power depended on both birth and service. These nobles held estates granted by the king, but their loyalty was often personal rather than institutional. In exchange for protection and land, they provided military support. Over time, these relationships of service and reward hardened into the bonds of vassalage that defined medieval Europe. The early Frankish kings, needing warriors more than bureaucrats, encouraged this system, often without realizing they were creating the framework for a new social order. By the time the Carolingians took the throne, the pattern was set. Kings ruled through their lords, and those lords ruled through their lands. The Church's growing power during the Merovingian era also left deep marks on European civilization. Clovis's alliance with the Catholic faith had given the Church a privileged place in the Frankish kingdom, and his successors built upon that foundation. The Merovingian kings endowed monasteries, supported missionary work, and gave the clergy legal privileges. In return, the Church provided moral legitimacy and administrative support. Monasteries became centers of education and record-keeping, preserving not only religious texts but also the remnants of Roman culture. This partnership between sacred and secular power became one of the defining features of the Middle Ages. The Church's influence would eventually grow to rival that of kings, but its rise began under the Merovingians, who saw in religion a means of unity and order. Economically, the Merovingian world bridged two eras. Trade had declined after the fall of Rome, but it never disappeared entirely. Under Merovingian rule, small markets and trade routes began to re-emerge, connecting local economies across Gaul and beyond. Coinage, though limited, continued to circulate, and royal mints produced gold and silver coins bearing the names of Merovingian kings. These coins were both symbols of authority and instruments of commerce. They reflected a world that, though smaller than Rome's, was still connected by networks of exchange. Over time, these economic habits would contribute to the slow revival of towns and markets that characterized the later Middle Ages. Culturally, the Merovingians preserved elements of both Roman and Germanic traditions, blending them into something new. Latin remained the language of the church and administration, while local dialects evolved in the countryside. The fusion of Roman literacy with Frankish oral custom created a distinctive culture that valued both written law and spoken oath. Art and craftsmanship also reflected this blend. The jewelry, weapons, and artifacts found in Merovingian graves reveal a people who valued beauty and symbolism as expressions of identity and status. Their art combined the geometric designs of Germanic tradition with the intricate detailing of Roman influence, producing a style that was both bold and refined. Despite their eventual eclipse, the Merovingians' influence on the development of European kingship was profound. They established the model of a Christian monarchy, one in which the ruler was not merely a warlord, but a guardian of faith. The idea that a king ruled by divine sanction and bore moral responsibility for his people would become central to medieval political thought. The coronation rituals of later centuries, in which kings were anointed with holy oil, echoed the sacred symbolism that had surrounded the Merovingian throne. Their legacy endured in the belief that kingship was both a political and spiritual office. The myths that surrounded the Merovingians continued to grow long after their dynasty had vanished. In medieval literature, they were sometimes portrayed as noble but tragic figures, rulers whose divine gifts had been squandered through pride or betrayal. In later centuries, particularly during the Renaissance and beyond, the Merovingians reappeared in the imagination of those who sought ancient origins for European power. The combination of mystery, faith, and forgotten grandeur made them ideal subjects for romantic speculation. Writers and mystics connected them to hidden lineages and secret traditions, often linking them to biblical and legendary themes. Though these later inventions bore little resemblance to historical truth, they reflected the enduring fascination with a dynasty that seemed to hover between history and myth. The notion of the Merovingians as a lost dynasty owes much to the way history is written. Victors shape memory, and the Carolingians, who replaced them, had every reason to present their own rise as both necessary and divinely ordained. The Merovingians, therefore, became the backdrop to the Carolingian story, their achievements overshadowed by the grandeur of Charlemagne and his empire. Yet without the Merovingians, the Carolingians would have had no foundation to build upon. The structures of law, land, and loyalty that sustained the Carolingian Empire were inherited directly from the Merovingian past. In a sense, the lost dynasty never truly vanished. It lived on in the institutions and ideas that continued to shape Europe. The Merovingian period was also a time of transition in the understanding of property and governance. Land, once seen mainly as a source of wealth and prestige, became the measure of power. The bond between land and service that developed during their reign would evolve into the feudal system that defined medieval life. At the same time, the idea of personal responsibility and oath-taking became central to social order. Agreements were sealed not by written contracts alone, but by spoken promises before God. This culture of personal loyalty and moral obligation gave medieval Europe its distinctive character, and its roots lay in the Merovingian blend of Roman administration and Frankish custom. Their influence extended even into the idea of Europe itself. The unification of diverse peoples under a single Christian ruler, first achieved by Clovis, provided a model for later visions of European unity. The concept of a Christian West, distinct from the Eastern Empire and bound by shared faith, language, and law, began under Merovingian rule. It was a fragile unity, often broken by war and ambition, but the idea remained, a legacy that would shape the medieval and even the modern imagination. In the centuries that followed, the Merovingians faded from the political stage, but their fingerprints remained on every part of European civilization. Their laws influenced medieval legal codes. Their relationship with the church defined the role of religion in governance. Their system of landholding became the backbone of feudal society. Even their myths continued to inspire those who looked to the past for meaning. In their story, later generations found a mirror of Europe's own evolution, from chaos to order, from paganism to faith, from tribe to kingdom. The Merovingian legacy is not one of grandeur and empire, but of continuity. They did not leave behind monuments like Rome or philosophies like Greece. Instead, they left institutions, habits, and symbols, things that endure quietly but shape the lives of generations. Their rule bridged two worlds, carrying forward the remnants of Rome into the medieval age and giving birth to the systems that would define Europe for 1,000 years. The myths and legends that surround them speak not only to what they were, but to what they represented. They were the first Christian kings of the West, heirs to a broken empire and founders of a new world. Their long hair, their sacred bloodline, their mysterious rise and fall, all became part of a story about transformation and endurance. Though their dynasty was lost, their influence remained, woven into the fabric of European history. The Merovingians may have faded into the shadows of legend, but from those shadows came the shape of the medieval world that followed, a world that still bore the marks of their rule long after their crowns had turned to dust. The story of the Merovingians ends not with their disappearance from power, but with the realization that they were the true architects of a new European world. Their dynasty, long overshadowed by those who came after, represented not a mere bridge between the ancient and medieval worlds, but the foundation upon which all that followed was built. To understand their legacy is to see that the birth of Europe was not a clean beginning, but a difficult transformation, a process of adaptation, loss, and reinvention that took place amid bloodshed, faith, and ambition. The Merovingians ruled in an age that historians have often labeled dark, yet from that darkness came the light of new political and cultural forms that would shape the continent for centuries. When the Roman Empire collapsed in the Western lands, it left behind not only ruins but a question: what would replace its order? The Merovingians were among the first to offer an answer, though their answer was born of necessity rather than design. They inherited a world in which cities had dwindled, long-distance trade had faltered, and authority was fragmented among warlords, bishops, and local leaders. Yet within that fragmentation lay opportunity. The Merovingian kings, beginning with Clovis, managed to unite disparate peoples under a shared rule and a shared faith. This act of unification, more than any later conquest, marked the true beginning of Europe as a coherent idea, a place where Roman memory, Christian belief, and Germanic custom combined to form something new. Their political structure was fragile, their administration inconsistent, and their power often personal rather than institutional. Yet within those limitations, they created patterns that endured. The Merovingian kingdom was not a restored Rome, but an evolving organism that reflected the needs of its time. Power depended on loyalty, and loyalty was bound to land and kinship. This model would later define the feudal age. Their government was local, decentralized, and flexible, qualities that allowed it to survive in a world of shifting borders and uncertain allegiances. In this way, the Merovingians did not fail to restore Roman order. They succeeded in creating a new one suited to the realities of post-imperial Europe. The Merovingians also demonstrated that authority could take multiple forms. Their kingship blended sacred and secular power in ways that would set the pattern for medieval monarchy. The king was not only a warrior and judge, but also a figure of spiritual significance. The long hair of the Merovingians symbolized not vanity, but sacred kingship, marking them as chosen by God. This intertwining of religion and rule established a model that would continue through the Carolingians and beyond, reaching its most elaborate expression in the coronations of later European monarchs. The belief that rulers governed by divine sanction, a belief that would define medieval political thought, found one of its earliest expressions under the Merovingians. Their relationship with the church was equally significant. While later rulers would expand the power of the clergy, the Merovingians were the first to forge a deep alliance between throne and altar. The conversion of Clovis to Nicene Christianity was not merely a personal act of faith, it was a political revolution. It aligned the Frankish kingdom with the spiritual authority of Rome and gave it a moral legitimacy that pagan or Arian rivals could not match. Through this union, the Merovingians helped to secure the dominance of Catholic Christianity in Western Europe. They supported the building of monasteries, endowed bishoprics, and allowed the church to serve as both moral guide and administrative partner. The church, in turn, preserved learning, stabilized society, and provided a sense of continuity in a time of upheaval. This partnership between sacred and secular power became the defining feature of medieval Europe, and it began in the Merovingian age. Their achievements were not always glorious. Much of their history was marked by violence, intrigue, and betrayal. Their courts were arenas of rivalry where assassination and ambition shaped destiny as much as faith and law. Yet these very struggles reveal the formative tensions of early Europe. The concept of rule by inheritance, rather than by appointment or conquest alone, gained strength during their reign. The division of kingdoms among sons, though destructive in the short term, reflected an early understanding of dynastic continuity and legal succession. In their attempt to balance family loyalty with royal authority, the Merovingians laid the groundwork for later notions of monarchy and governance. The myth of decline that has long surrounded their dynasty often obscures the quiet continuity they achieved. Even as power passed to the mayors of the palace and the Carolingians rose in prominence, the structures the Merovingians had built remained intact. The kingdom they created, stretching across much of what would become France, Belgium, and Germany, survived their political eclipse. The Carolingians inherited not a vacuum, but a functioning realm shaped by Merovingian precedent. In that sense, the so-called do-nothing kings did not preside over decay, but over transformation. Their age saw the consolidation of regions, the codification of law, and the growth of institutions that would underpin medieval society. To reevaluate the Merovingians is to see that they were not simply a transitional dynasty, but the founders of Europe in its medieval form. The world they ruled was neither the Roman Empire restored nor the medieval kingdoms fully formed, but something between, a crucible in which the raw materials of a new civilization were forged. The Roman idea of centralized power gave way to a more personal and local model of authority, while the ancient tribal codes evolved into written laws. Christianity spread not only as faith, but as a framework for governance and morality. Out of these elements came the Europe that would later produce cathedrals, universities, and empires. Their cultural contributions were subtler, but no less lasting. The Merovingian world saw the preservation of Latin learning through monastic scriptoria, the continuation of artistic craftsmanship, and the blending of Roman, Germanic, and Christian artistic forms. The intricate metalwork, jewelry, and illuminated manuscripts of their age reveal a society that valued beauty and symbolism even amid turmoil. These artistic expressions, often tied to faith and burial, reflected a deep sense of continuity between life and eternity. In this way, the Merovingians helped to shape the aesthetic spirit of medieval Europe, where art was not decoration but devotion, and craftsmanship was an act of faith. Their system of landholding created the social structure that would define Europe for centuries. Under the Merovingians, land was the basis of wealth, status, and power. Kings granted estates to warriors and nobles in exchange for loyalty and service, establishing bonds that were both personal and political. These relationships evolved into the feudal hierarchies of the later Middle Ages. The Merovingian pattern of patronage and obligation made loyalty tangible, rooted in the soil itself. The sense of belonging to both land and lord became the cornerstone of European identity, shaping everything from law to warfare to social custom. Even in their decline, the Merovingians taught a lesson about the limits of power. As their authority weakened and their nobles grew more independent, Europe learned that stability required balance between king and subject, between faith and politics, between center and locality. The struggles of their later centuries were not signs of failure, but part of the process by which medieval Europe found its equilibrium. Every assassination, every court intrigue, every shifting alliance revealed the tensions inherent in creating a new order out of the ruins of an old one. In this sense, the Merovingian age was Europe's childhood, tumultuous, uncertain, yet filled with potential. Their impact on law and governance extended beyond their lifetime. The Salic law, first codified under Clovis, became one of the most influential legal traditions in Europe. Its rules of inheritance, compensation, and social hierarchy reflected a world that valued order through custom. The principle that land and titles should pass through male heirs would later influence royal succession disputes across centuries, shaping the politics of kingdoms long after the Merovingians themselves had faded. The law's emphasis on personal responsibility and reparation rather than punishment anticipated later developments in European jurisprudence. Through such measures, the Merovingians transformed tribal norms into enduring legal principles. Religiously, their era marked the true rooting of Christianity in the soil of Western Europe. The faith that had once been an urban religion of the Roman elite became a rural, popular faith under the Merovingians. Monks, bishops, and missionaries spread across the countryside, founding monasteries that served as centers of worship, education, and agriculture. These monasteries preserved ancient texts, taught new skills, and offered refuge in times of war. They became the heart of a new civilization that valued both prayer and labor. The Merovingian alliance with the Church thus did more than sanctify kingship. It helped to shape the moral and intellectual landscape of Europe itself. The political geography of Europe also owes much to the Merovingian period. The regions that would later become France and Germany took shape within the boundaries of their kingdom. The division of their realm among heirs often followed natural and linguistic lines, creating the early distinctions between Eastern and Western territories. These divisions, though sources of conflict, also laid the groundwork for the national identities that would emerge in later centuries. In this way, the Merovingians were not only founders of a kingdom, but midwives of nations. Their diplomacy and wars, though often brutal, taught Europe the art of negotiation and alliance. The Merovingian kings managed a delicate balance among rival tribes, neighboring kingdoms, and the Byzantine Empire. They used marriage, religion, and tribute as tools of statecraft, laying the foundations for the diplomatic traditions that would characterize medieval and early modern Europe. Even their failures revealed the emerging complexity of European politics, where power was no longer measured only by conquest, but by the ability to manage alliances and maintain legitimacy. As later generations looked back, the Merovingians came to symbolize the mysterious birth of Europe, a time when the ancient world had crumbled, but the new had not yet taken shape. Their story, filled with contradictions, reflects the complexity of that transformation. They were both barbarian and Roman, pagan and Christian, tribal and royal. They ruled through violence but sought divine approval. They inherited the ruins of an empire, yet built the outlines of a civilization. These contradictions are not signs of confusion, but of creation. The Europe that followed was born not from order, but from struggle, not from purity, but from mixture. The Merovingians embodied that mixture, and through them, Europe learned to define itself. In the centuries that followed, historians often dismissed their age as a prelude, a dark passage before the brilliance of Charlemagne and the Carolingians. Yet such judgments underestimate the depth of their achievement. The Carolingians did not arise from nothing. They inherited a framework of governance, faith, and culture built by the Merovingians. Even as new dynasties rose and fell, the institutions and values shaped in Merovingian times endured. Their laws influenced kingdoms across the continent. Their fusion of sacred and secular authority remained the model for monarchy. Their partnership with the Church became the foundation of medieval Christendom. The Merovingian story is, in the end, the story of Europe's becoming. They lived in a time of endings and beginnings, of ruins and renewal. Their world was violent, uncertain, and often cruel, but it was also fertile ground for innovation. From their struggles came the systems of landholding, law, and loyalty that defined the Middle Ages. From their faith came the unity of a Christian Europe. From their ambition came the idea of kingship as both moral and political responsibility. Their dynasty may have faded, but the world they shaped endured. To see the Merovingians clearly is to understand that Europe was not born in peace or clarity, but through conflict and adaptation. The empire that fell left behind no guide for what would follow, and yet, through trial and error, the Merovingians created a new order. They were not the caretakers of Rome's memory, but the founders of something distinct, a Europe that would evolve through centuries of change, yet remain rooted in the patterns they first established. Their legacy is not measured in monuments or empire, but in endurance. They gave Europe its first laws, its first Christian monarchy, and its first sense of unity after the collapse of Rome. They transformed chaos into continuity, turning the remnants of the ancient world into the framework of the medieval. To call their time dark is to miss its purpose. It was not darkness without light, but the necessary shadow from which a new dawn emerged. In their age, Europe learned how to survive without empire, how to rule without uniformity, and how to believe without certainty. The Merovingians, through their faith, their struggles, and their contradictions, gave shape to a civilization that was still learning what it meant to be European. Their story, once told as a tale of decline, now stands as the story of creation, a creation born of conflict, faith, and resilience. The Merovingians were not a passing phase. They were the pulse of a new beginning, the first rulers of a continent that was still finding its identity. Their world, harsh and imperfect, was the crucible in which the ideas, institutions, and identities of Europe were forged. When we speak of Europe's true birth pangs, we speak of them, the kings with long hair and restless ambition, the queens and nobles who shaped law and lineage, the monks who kept faith alive, the warriors who fought for land and loyalty. From their chaos came continuity, from their darkness came light. In their time, the old world ended, and the new began.